Russia has finally pushed the United States to its breaking point. After yet another brutal airstrike against Kyiv, one that left multiple civilians dead, including a 3-month-old baby, the U.S. has decided enough is enough. Any lingering hope in Washington that Vladimir Putin might still be searching for a path to peace has evaporated. This time the U.S. is moving past warnings and empty threats. According to one economist, the move America is preparing, when combined with the long list of sanctions already in place, could break the Russian economy within a year. On September 7th, U.S. President Donald Trump briefly stopped to speak with reporters before boarding Air Force One. He fielded a series of questions on topics ranging from autism to crime rates in American cities. But for Ukraine, one question mattered more than all the others. Was he ready to move forward with the second phase of sanctions against Russia? Trump's answer was short and sharp. "Yeah, I am," he said. Just 3 words, but they carried a weighty message. It was a direct signal to Putin. The U.S. sees the duplicity. It sees the attacks, and it's prepared to strike back economically. The contrast is impossible to miss. One week Putin is sitting down with Trump and insisting Russia is willing to work toward peace with Ukraine, provided the terms are right. Days later, he orders the largest airstrike of the war, hitting cities across Ukraine, including the capital, and killing civilians, among them a baby. Trump has had enough of the doublespeak. The second phase of U.S. sanctions is being drawn up. What exactly that means is still unclear. Trump's terse statement came in the middle of a quick press exchange where he offered little detail, whether by design or out of necessity. He did not specify what Phase 2 might include. Still, there are several possible directions. One option would be an expansion of tariffs that function as secondary sanctions. These would target not only Russia but also the countries still buying Russian oil. Trump has already tested this approach. Earlier this year, India was hit with a steep new 25% tariff on top of its existing 25% levy, bringing the total to 50%. The move was a punishment for India's continued imports of Russian crude. And India is hardly alone in keeping Russia's oil sector afloat. China, Turkey, and the European Union remain major buyers, with China by far the most significant. The Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air reported that between December 2022 and June 2025, China accounted for nearly half of all Russian crude exports and more than 10% of refined oil product purchases. That level of dependence makes Beijing the obvious target if Washington decides to widen its secondary sanctions. But targeting China is a very different calculation from punishing India. China's economy is massive, and its government has already shown a willingness to retaliate when it feels pressured. The U.S. Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, hinted at this possible strategy recently, suggesting that the U.S. and the European Union could together impose tariffs on countries buying Russian oil. Done in concert, he argued, such sanctions could deliver a crippling blow to Russia's finances. Whether tariffs alone will be enough is another matter. Richard Portes, a professor at the London Business School, believes Phase 2 will need to go further. Speaking to Times Radio, he argued that the 23,160 sanctions already in place since February 2022 have made a dent in Russia's economy, but haven't yet been decisive. To shut down Putin's ambitions once and for all, the West would need to find a way to block oil exports almost completely. That, however, is far easier said than done. India's discounted purchases of Russian oil illustrate the challenge. Even after the new 25% tariff, India remains a huge buyer. The U.S. may have to accept serious costs to key relationships if it wants to stop Russia's oil revenues at the source. Still, the logic is straightforward. Russia is selling oil at a discount because it has no choice. The country's war has drained its reserves. It is running a budget deficit, and foreign exchange holdings are thin. Oil exports are one of the few remaining sources of hard currency. Cut that revenue off, and the pressure on Moscow becomes unbearable. As Portes put it, sanctions are biting, but they need to be tighter. If Trump's promise of a second phase means a more aggressive effort to strangle Russia's oil income, then the noose around Putin's economy could finally begin to close. The trouble comes when China is involved. Portes is blunt about it. China is a threat. India is not. The contrast could not be starker. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has tried to flex against U.S. pressure. appearing publicly with Putin and signaling an openness to closer ties with Beijing. He has promised support for Indian exporters hurt by American tariffs, but India's ability to retaliate is limited. Its economy is heavily reliant on exports, and the U.S. is its single largest customer. The BBC recently suggested that the new tariff alone could cost India $35 billion in lost trade during the 2025 fiscal year and potentially wipe out hundreds of thousands of jobs. In short, India has little leverage. If New Delhi tries to retaliate with tariffs of its own, as it did in 2019, when it imposed duties on 28 U.S. products, it risks hurting itself more than Washington. Trade numbers show why. India sells roughly $86 billion worth of goods to the United States each year, more than triple the volume of U.S. exports to India. The power imbalance is obvious, which is why Washington feels confident enough to squeeze India, in the hopes that it will eventually seek other oil suppliers. China, though, is an entirely different story. Beijing has the resources and the political will to fight back. Ports notes that China can retaliate economically or even militarily if pushed too hard. While his comment about inexperienced U.S. officials might sting, the underlying truth is valid. Washington cannot strong-arm China the way it can India. The numbers show why. In June 2025 alone, China exported $325 billion worth of goods while importing $210 billion, leaving a massive $115 billion trade surplus. It is the world's second-largest economy, with a GDP of nearly $18 trillion. Tariffs hurt, but they don't break China. In fact, the U.S. has already tried extreme tariffs in the past at one point, exceeding 100%, only for China to engage in tit-for-tat retaliation until both sides scaled back. Beijing has proven it can absorb the costs and keep going. That means any secondary sanction strategy that touches China must be crafted with extreme caution. Yes, it could damage Russia by curbing its biggest customer, but it could also unleash a damaging trade war with Beijing. Meanwhile, Ukraine is demanding action. Hours after the September 7 attack, President Volodymyr Zelensky took to X to call the strike what it was: a deliberate crime and a rejection of diplomacy. Such killings now, when real diplomacy could have already begun long ago, are a deliberate crime and a prolongation of the war, he wrote. He reminded Trump that Washington had promised sanctions if Russia refused to negotiate. We must implement everything that was agreed in Paris, he said, pressing for the next phase to be enacted immediately. In a later message, Zelensky broadened his appeal, urging leaders to back words with action. Sanctions, tariffs, restrictions, he said these are the only tools that truly convince Putin that the world is serious. His message came as more than 90 rescuers, 160 police officers, and 200 utility workers combed through the rubble in Kyiv. The scale of the cleanup effort highlighted the enormous strain Russia's strikes are placing on Ukrainian cities. If now is not the time for the second phase of sanctions, Zelensky seems to be asking, then when? Suppose Trump does go all in, extending tariffs to every major buyer of Russian oil, even China. The immediate effects may not be visible, but Russia's economy is already showing signs of deep stress. Just days before the strike on September 4th, the Moscow Times quoted German Greff, CEO of Sberbank, warning that Russia was heading into what he called technical stagnation. This is not an outsider. Sberbank is Russia's largest bank, largely state-owned, and Greff is typically aligned with the Kremlin. For him to sound alarm bells publicly is striking. Greff blamed high interest rates, saying recovery would only be possible if rates dropped from the projected 14% to 12% or lower. Ports dismisses this view as missing the point. Inflation remains high, and rates closer to 18% may be necessary to keep it in check. The deeper issue, he says, is that Russia is operating a war economy that deprives consumers of goods and drains labor by sending young men to the front lines. Growth is approaching zero and may soon slip into decline. Technical stagnation is just a euphemism for crisis. On this, both Greff and Portes agree. The Russian economy is in major trouble. Add Phase 2 sanctions on top of the existing measures, and the pressure could become unbearable. Portes believes the collapse will come within a year, not two. I think the Russian economy is in deep trouble, and 24 months is a long time. I'd say 12. Within the next 12 months, there is going to be serious economic disruption, he told Times Radio. For Putin, that timeline is catastrophic. His options are narrowing. He could begin looking for a way out, whether that means ending the war or stepping down as president entirely. As recently as May, a Russian documentary revealed that Putin keeps a list of potential successors for when he eventually leaves power. If he is already thinking about succession, the added pressure of new U.S. sanctions might accelerate his departure. The other path is the one he knows best, doubling down. Ports expects that Putin will try to divert even more resources from civilian needs into the war effort. But that strategy worsens the very problems causing Russia's economic pain. Consumers are already sacrificing. Ukraine's strikes on Russian refineries, combined with sanctions that block access to critical components, have slashed fuel supplies. Up to 20% of refining capacity is offline. Queues are forming at gas stations and prices are soaring. Putin has floated the idea of falling back on coal, boasting that Russia's reserves could last nearly 1,000 years. But relying on coal to replace refined oil is a massive step backward, a clear sign that sanctions and Ukrainian strikes are creating problems Moscow cannot solve. The pressure is visible. More sanctions combined with Ukraine's battlefield successes could push the Russian people to a breaking point. Anger will rise as the Kremlin siphons more money into the war while citizens struggle with high inflation, interest rates, and shortages. Could China bail Putin out? Perhaps temporarily, but Portes argues the limits are already clear. Even though trade between the two countries hit record levels in 2024, Beijing cannot keep Russia's entire economy afloat. It can replace some imports lost from the West, but it cannot plug the massive holes left by sanctions and lost oil revenue. That leaves Putin cornered. Phase 2, whatever form it takes, will pile more strain on a leader whose economy is already bending under the weight of war. The next year looks grim for Russia. Economists like Ports warn that the country may not even make it to the summer of 2026 without plunging into full-blown economic crisis. And while the U.S. prepares its next move, Ukraine is already retaliating directly. Russia hit Kyiv and Ukraine struck back hard. The war shows no signs of slowing. For Putin, the walls are closing in. The question is whether he can withstand the pressure or whether Trump's next round of sanctions will finally force Russia's back to break.